Hello and welcome back to the Student Hub Live. Well, I hope you're enjoying today's programme. We've already covered critical thinking and compare and contrast. Now, if you've missed any of those, they're available on the catch-up after today's show, and also you can check out loads more content on our Student Hub Live YouTube channel just by Googling that or by visiting the website and watching the catch-up options. Now, this part of the programme is one of two about the beginning and the end of an essay. And I have my colleague Isabella Henman, who does the Adobe Connect sessions with me. Welcome, Isabella. And we have decided to tell everybody about conclusions first.
We have.
And I've decided as well that because everyone comes here and says the same sorts of things, and I'm really trying to identify the differences between things, as you've seen, like critical evaluation and compare and contrast, I thought we need the same person doing introductions and conclusions, because they're all going to say, well, you need to frame it like this, and then you need to tell everyone what you've done. So none of that. We're going to really knuckle down and get to grips with the difference between the two. Yeah. Why did we decide to talk about conclusions before introductions?
Because, bizarrely enough, you probably will write your conclusion first. Because you write your essay, you collect everything and using all the fantastic ideas that they've already talked about today, and collect it and write the essay, and then you know what you're writing and therefore you can conclude it all. I'm not going to touch on the introductions too much now, but the idea is that you then write that afterwards, because having written it, you know what is going to be covered, if that makes sense. It's a slightly odd one, but it does make sense when you think about it a bit more.
Now, Suzanne does a rough draft conclusion always first, so that's
good.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So we're asking lots of questions. We'd like to know whether you write your essay beginning with the introduction, conclusion, or the bits in the middle, and also whether you write the conclusion before or after the introduction. Again, you know, everyone does things their own ways. There's no right or wrong. We're certainly not sitting here saying this is the only way to do it. It is a way, and we're going to explain why it can be a helpful way, but equally you develop your own style and do your own thing. So just let us know what you do. We've also got a Wordle, which is where we need three things. So if you can think of one or two, that is fine, but just put a full stop in the other box, otherwise it won't submit. What do you find most challenging about conclusions? We're also asking about percentage of the word count. This is a very common thing that we're asked about. Now, again, we have students from all over the university. Some parts of the university are quite specific about the extent to which they want a certain proportion of the word count allocated to the introduction or conclusion. But tell us how it works for you. So is your conclusion about 5, 10, 15 or 20% of the entire word count of your assignment? And also, we've thought about feedback. Now, some of you are just starting out your OU journey, so you might not have had some feedback yet. But if you have had feedback, what are the sorts of things that your tutor might pick up on and say to you about your conclusion? Do they think it's great, too descriptive? I mean, we've listed a couple of points there, but it might be that you want to put something in the chat about what your feedback's been on your conclusion, and maybe there's something we can help you with. And if you're a brand new student, of course, do put any questions in the chat as well, and HJ will put those to us in the studio. OK, so the conclusion then is something that some people like Suzanne will write in their draft, and then they will work through together. Broadly speaking, what is the point of the conclusion?
It's a summary, and it makes it clear what you covered, why you covered, but more importantly, how you covered it. Because there's all sorts of bits of information, and you can collect lots of information to your essay, but the way that you actually achieve that depends on your end result. So we've got some props here, which we were talking about, and we said, well, you can combine eggs, butter, flour and sugar in a variety of different ways. All of these have them in. So these could be a different example of your essay, but it depends on how you tackled them, depends on what happens. So hopefully that sort of makes sense to people. I'm not going to spend too long on that, because otherwise it's the smell of the donuts.
They'll all be talking about, I can tell you exactly what's going to happen now, Isabella, is they'll all talk about cake. Michaela's mesmerised by your hair. HJ, how's everyone at home?
We're doing really well. We're thinking about that point of whether or not we write it first or before the introduction. A lot of people do a rough draft of the conclusion first, as we said, then write the body of the essay and then kind of refine what we're doing. Libby said, we're always working towards our conclusion. So we write. She writes it first and then writes the body of the essay and then the introduction. But, and Davin just wants you to share the cake, so...
We're not sharing the cakes, Davin, sorry. I'm going to eat all the cakes later. So So you said this word summary, Isabella, and I think this is one of
Yeah.
the most common misconceptions about conclusions.
Absolutely.
In particular for new students who think, okay, so your conclusion tells me what you've done. I've combined the eggs, flour, butter and sugar, and I have therefore made this. So what is the point of that, especially if someone's already read what you've done?
Exactly. So that's the thing. It's a summary, but it's not giving the same information.
Right.
So this is the interesting point. It's a really good one to say that some people have an idea of their conclusion as they're writing, which is a good way of doing it because you need to make it clear how you're tackling your question.
Yeah.
How does your conclusion answer it? Because you have, through a lot of detail, and in your much shorter section, it explains what was most important. Obviously, all of it is important because it's gone into your essay, but there's some things that are far more important to summarise and snip it out and go, well, actually, the way that we dealt with the eggs the way that we folded in the flour actually made the Victoria sponge in a different way than we combined them together in the pancake. So in an essay format, certain of the topics are far more important. So again, you're not just repeating them, and it's not just, I covered this, this, this and this, because as you said, your reader's already said that. They've already read it, they've already seen it. But it's how you did that and which were the most critical things. So you really do need to have a very good appreciation of your essay and what you have covered to be able to write your conclusion, because it really is what was most important, what made the answer what it was.
So say the question, I mean, for this example would be, go and make something using flour, butter, eggs and sugar, okay? And so you talk about the things that you're doing in the essay with those set ingredients. So the conclusion then is saying, okay, you told me to go and bake something in the kitchen. I've done that. And what I have made for you is this thing, so the Victoria sponge. Yeah. And what's important about the Victoria sponge is this part of the process. So even though you're mentioning the flour, butter and eggs, what you're saying is it's how you combine those and what matters. So even though you've already explained that to your reader, you're bringing it all together almost and saying, well, this is the great thing about a Victoria sponge. These are the important things about it, and this is how it's delivered on the brief, and this is what I've made.
Yeah, and this is why it's a Victoria sponge.
And not a yam-yam.
Yeah, or a donut, or a Scotch pancake, or a muffin. So
I call them pikelets.
Oh, pikelets are those weird things with...
No, that's a pikelet. We could
we
argue this all day. Believe me, with my fellow New Zealanders.
we aren't going to that one. But yeah, it is, and it's a difficult way to explain it in lots of different words, because it really is about understanding your topic. So, for instance, if we were being asked to, how could you combine these together, or write an essay about colouring your hair?
Yes.
Well, actually, what was the most important thing about, or doing something with your hair? Well, in my case, it was the colour. In your case, you were making sure it's nice and smooth, whereas I'm curly.
I wasn't.
So I'm trying to promote you here.
I did my hair, yeah.
So it's about, there's different ways of approaching things, but only by knowing the end product and knowing the final thing can you actually work out what was the most important thing. I know that's very tricky for students who are going, but I don't know how to start. Well, at the moment, we're talking about the end. We're talking about how you sum it all up. You don't have to go, I wrote this and then I covered that and then I covered that, because that's not really a summary. That's a step-by-step guide. Whereas it's actually more important to say, I covered this because it was critical this way. And you don't have to mention the other things that you've covered, because they were important, but they're not part of the summary. They're not part of the overall conclusion. Because, yes, they're there, but they weren't instrumental for how you answered the final question in that way. Because remember, it's a shortened summary. It's not a repeat.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the food analogies are making Ruth very hungry. And Davin says he always has to refrain from writing, in conclusion, I'm glad I have finished.
Yes, yeah. And that's a really tricky thing, because for those of you who are new to writing, often you will have been taught to write, in conclusion, I have covered this, this and this, or will have even been told your conclusion is a past tense version of your introduction. We really want to try and get people away from that, because it's not saying how it's important, it's not saying how you tackled it or why you tackled it, because you know now you've written it what was most important. Well, some of it, yes, you finished, as Davin said, because I finished, yay, and because I've got a deadline, but that's not actually the reason why you included the information that you did.
No.
The key bits were because I
had to. No.
You're not being helped.
All right, let's see what everyone has to say at home, because we have asked, what do you find most challenging about conclusions? Now, if you haven't filled in the Wordle yet, let us know 3 things, or 1 or 2. You can just put a full stop in that box so that your results will submit, and then we can find out what you find most challenging about conclusions and hopefully give you some feedback on how you might tackle that. HJ?
Well, one thing we are saying is that we're finding the example using cakes very useful, but we are very hungry now. So we might go off for lunch in a bit. But one of the things we're finding challenging is not repeating ourselves, deciding on flow as well. How do we go from the main body into the conclusion? And the last sentence as well. How do you finally finish it all off and wrap it up and read it in a way that makes the reader comfortable as well? So there's quite a lot of things we're struggling with, and I think they do develop over time as well, don't they?
Yeah, they do develop over time, and so there's some good points to say. So the final sentence is your final take-home message. In the same way as you think about a book and they have brilliant first lines of books, you almost want to have a really good final sentence which sums up your key, that makes it relate back to your original topic. I'm doing that because obviously at the start of the essay and I wave my hands. But that's quite a good thing to think about, to sum it up. And we were talking about this idea about a funnel as well, and about bringing things in, so the main body, and then you needed to make it nice and clear, aiming towards that final sentence.
Yeah.
So the not repeating bit is thinking about what was most important. I was talking to somebody earlier about how you know when you're not writing in your own words.
Yeah.
Because imagine you've actually just read through your essay, you've read it out loud. Now explain it to somebody in 100 words. So that's almost your conclusion. What was the most important things? You're not going to use the same words because you can't, because you haven't got enough.
Yeah.
So that could be another way of doing it. If you're struggling, right, think, okay, I've just written 1,000 words, or I've written 500 words, I want to get it maybe 10%. So I want to get about 3 or 4 sentences. How can I do that? What is most important? What summarises that essay that is the take-home points? Because that could be another way of approaching it, actually.
When Paul came on this morning, we had a question and he brought some evidence and we evaluated and we gave star ratings using our magic stars. Other chocolates are available. And we decided that actually, even though there were things there, some were really, really essential and some were a lot more meaningful than others. So what I want to ask you now is, with the conclusion, how might we use that to sort of try and convey the gravity of some of these points? Because effectively the conclusion's pulling it all together. It's saying, right, you've asked me this question, I've told you this, this and this and this, and this is how I've delivered on my answer, right? How do you then start to use those? Because it's this question that HJ raised again about the flow.
Yes.
Do you need to say in order of what you did, or is this a good time to maybe unpack that order? Say you've started with the flour and the butter and the sugar, for example, and you think, actually, is that really essential for the conclusion? Do I need to repeat the flow I've had in my essay?
I would say no. If you're struggling, then yes, do. Don't go, oh, I'm being told to go completely away, which makes it, there's yet another task to do.
Yeah.
So if it helps, then think, right, you've got three main paragraphs in it. So you've got introduction, conclusion, 3 main, as an example.
Yeah.
So what's your main summary point of paragraph 1?
Yeah.
How would you synthesise that into 8 to 10 words in a sentence? Same for paragraph 2, same for paragraph 3.
Yeah.
Then you could have a nice flow.
Yeah.
That would be one way of doing it. An alternative would say, right, what is the most important take-home message overall, this the theme that runs through all of them, not necessarily the separate topics, but what, like we're talking about, well, the food. The most important thing is we've made food. We haven't actually mentioned that because it's individual things, but actually it's about making food from ingredients in that example. So the essay is, what were you asked to do? And that is your most important thing. Yeah. You tackled it in the introduction, the individual paragraphs, and then you're summarising it. But remember, the most important thing, the single most important summary is, what were you asked?
Yeah.
What are you actually doing?
Yeah.
So that will always be your guide. And you always have to keep going back and going, does this relate directly?
Yeah.
Have I answered it? Have I showed how I've answered that in there? If I haven't, sorry, you're going to have another look at it.
Yeah, because the thing with these that differentiates them is what you've done with the butter and sugar ultimately.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the essential, most important thing that will mean that won't turn out like that. And so in the conclusion, I love what you said before about, I guess, putting it away and going, what was I writing about? And
Yes.
sometimes when you close your books or turn your computer off and you think, what am I actually trying to say?
Yeah.
And then how does that actually help
Yeah.
meet this question? You can then think about what it adds.
You can almost do your idea of a word. Or what,
Yeah.
Well, what would be your key words? If you, for instance, were asked to talk about it, could you have 10 cue cards? I remember years ago at school, we had to do a 10-minute presentation. We were allowed to have 10 prompt words. It
Yeah.
was one of the most difficult things I've ever done, because at the time I didn't know how to do that. I still don't know whether I've managed to do
Oh, well, you're older now.
I'm older now, theoretically I know what I'm doing. But yeah, so could you actually have 10 words that summed it up?
Yeah.
I know that's sort of taking it a little bit on a tangent,
Yeah.
but actually, if you were going to explain it to somebody
Yeah.
in 10 words and do that, could
Yeah.
you do that? Because
Okay.
that will show you what's most important. They might be the theme,
Yeah.
they might be some key terms that were in part of it, they
Yeah.
might be some facts, or if you're writing about it could be a particular person that underlies it.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's all sorts of topics it could be, and it depends on what you're writing about,
Yeah.
what those keys could be. So yeah, maybe you could do that. So you could either do 10 words, you could have the flow, summarising the paragraphs, you could have anything. But remember, it's about the how. What has the conclusion? The conclusion is saying how you tackled the essay.
Yeah.
What was important? I just want to keep bringing it back to that idea.
Yeah.
It's not what you did, it's how
Yeah.
all of those bits were important
Okay.
to answer the question.
So you framed, and we'll talk about this when we talk about introductions later,
Yeah.
but you framed your argument like we
Yes.
all have here. We've said we're talking about this, this and this. We're not talking about all that, but we're talking about
Yes.
this. We've framed our parameters. So we've got a take on the question. And in
Yes.
your conclusion, you'll tell your reader what that take on the
Absolutely,
question was
yeah.
and how all the evidence has met it. Now, the other point that HJ raised from someone at home was about that last sentence and this whole funnel idea, because sometimes we all want to end with some sort of profound thing.
Yep.
I still do.
Yeah.
And you all want to just go, you know, how can I end and leap into this abyss of meaningfulness and really elevate my essay with it? And often those last words can really undermine all the hard work that have gone into a good conclusion.
Yeah.
Because, for example, say we ended this essay with, food is just so good.
Yeah, it's like,
It's brilliant.
well, it is, but why was that relevant? Yeah, and you do get that, and you get some people will put a really philosophical statement in, which is great, but it's, as you say, it's undermined. It's not to do with that. Or the other thing that you need to make sure you don't do is don't suddenly go, and it would be really good to investigate this further.
And have it with tea and coffee.
It's like,
and
no, that's not what it is.
Yeah.
Because some people, and I think sometimes it's from things like journal articles, they
Yeah.
have a conclusion and future directions.
Yes.
We
particular
don't,
in STEM subjects.
yeah, and now in essays we don't really do future directions unless you're actively asked to.
Yeah.
So of course there may be times when you're told,
Yeah.
and what other questions could be raised. Fine,
Yeah.
if you're asked to do that, but in general, and we have to talk in generalism here because we can't
Yes,
possibly
yes,
cover
yes,
all the
yes.
specifics. Is that you are not going off on that.
Yeah.
You are funneling. You are going. This is the whole essay.
Yeah.
I'm going to synthesise it here in terms of what was most important to
Yeah.
answer my question.
So it's almost like if we've got this plate that's our parameter of our
Yeah.
discussion, we're not going to include beverages of any sort.
No.
It's only fair game to comment on the introduction
Absolutely.
and conclusion about what's in your
Yes.
parameter or your
Completely,
platter.
yes. And you have to have a good idea. One of the reasons why we're doing this conclusion things first is because you've got to write it after writing the essay because you need to know what the
Yes.
parameter was. Because
Yes.
when you first look at an essay, you might go, I don't know.
Yeah.
And then you start collecting information, and then it starts making sense in your head, and you go, okay, this
Yeah.
is my, what was
Yeah.
the word you used earlier? My take on it.
yeah.
And you only develop your take through actually developing it along the way.
Yeah.
You can't, well, some people do. Some people go, well, this is what I want to do
Yeah.
from the start.
Yeah.
And they have a firm idea.
Yeah.
Be careful about that because
Yeah.
your conclusion then could be very opinionated. And if you end up very opinionated, again, you can miss on some of the things that were more important. So just be aware of that one.
Yeah. Good. Okay, Anne and Michaela are finding this really useful and are taking lots of notes. So let's see how everyone is at home.
Well, on note-taking, I think we need for some really helpful advice. We talked about conclusions, not repeating ourselves. We're struggling with our notes. So when we take notes, how do we know what the most important thing is? Or don't. I know when I started, I used to write everything page for page, and I quickly learnt that wasn't very efficient. But what would your advice be to know what the most important thing is to take down in our notes? Because that would help us later on with our essays, wouldn't it?
It's probably the key facts, so you're looking for the key terms. A lot of modules are really helpful, they've got bold terms, and if they're glossary terms, then there's something you need to know about. Obviously, don't just note all of them down and write the definitions, because it doesn't always help, but it's about thinking, if you've got any sentence, what conveys the meaning of that sentence? There's lots of fluff, there's lots of other bits in there. The way I'm talking, there's lots of fluff. The key thing is the key terms.
Yeah.
That's probably the most obvious way, and your understanding of those key terms, making sure your understanding is what it's supposed to be, not what you'd like it to be, as we say.
It's interesting because we try and bring examples to the Student Hub Live studio of things that people can relate to, and cakes are always a winner. But we've had lots of examples here today about things that people can do. One of the things I think that so many OU students don't tend to recognise is that they've built up all of these skills, baking, eating, doing things, managing the children, juggling work, and actually they've got so many transferable skills that they can bring to this. Now, in terms of this idea about taking notes, I mean, taking notes is I guess, a way of recording what's important. But identifying what's important is really critical. And the conclusion, I guess, is a real chance to be able to sort of sense check that in your mind, because sometimes you'll write an essay, I've done it, you go away and you think, I can't remember what I've been writing about. I can't I know I've gone because I've been told I need to go about this study and that study, so I've written about them. But actually, can I remember what they did? How meaningful is it? I know it's important because it's in the book.
Yes.
So how do we use the sort of thinking space around a conclusion then to try and make sense of how some of the stuff that we often think we don't have much liberty, especially at level one, you're writing about what people are telling you to write about. How might you then use the space to really think, well, what is my argument?
So it's going back to the question. How did you answer the question? Which of the bits allowed you to answer the question as opposed to just adding a bit of detail? Or were there any bits that, yes, you were told to put them in because they were facts, they were supporting facts. If you'd taken them out, would you have missed being able to answer the question? I suppose that's one way of thinking about it. There's lots and lots of detail there. Yes, it all answers the question. Are any of them absolutely critical that you wouldn't be able to answer the question without having those in?
Yeah. Suzanne tries to condense every paragraph into a sentence, so she can identify. And in the video we showed with Stephanie as well, she said that that's one technique of trying to identify and unpick your argument, so that you can find out what those sentences are to see how the flow's built up. Yeah,
again, it's the think about the keywords, or could you do this in one sentence?
Yeah.
Maybe one sentence with lots of commas in rather than additional words, but what's the main theme? It does come back to, you do need to understand the purpose. So maybe have a step back and go, why was that important? If like in level one, in the modules I tutor, we do give a lot of guidance and say, we need to make sure you cover this, this and this and this. Why were they important? Could you work out why we told you to? If you can't, ask your tutor, because they probably give you a bit of guidance, but have a little think. So I'm thinking of one of my examples, something to do with pain. Well, we're given examples of how we feel pain, when we don't feel pain and that kind of stuff. Well, actually, that's all integral to being able to understand it. And because we're people, we can understand pain. I know that's a theme example, but maybe think about it in that way. Why were you asked to do those? How did they relate overall?
Now, I want to end by talking about level, because you mentioned earlier, you know, if all else fails, just tell people what you did. But I think especially we've got a lot of Access students here today, and we're both involved in Access.
We are,
and we've got a lot of students at level one, and for them writing conclusions can be really quite a daunting process. And at level one, as we know, you know, you're learning, you're going along, the grades don't count towards your degree classification. So, you know, to some extent, this is the space to make lots of mistakes. At level 2 and 3, conclusions can really elevate your argument, and they become so much more important. But I wonder what we can say to those students who might feel a bit anxious about conclusions and this whole idea they might not have written for a long time. What would be the sort of basic thing that they should do in terms of summing up their argument in a perfectly adequate way? We've talked about a lot of complexities, but what would you say to those students who are just feeling a bit anxious about it?
So, summarise what you've said in terms of look at each paragraph and think, what were your things that you were most proud of in there? That would be a good start, because it's about getting feedback. If you were proud of it, think about why you were proud of it. Was it because you phrased it in a really nice way?
Yeah.
Then, okay, if we said if the marks don't count towards the final degree classification, then at least you can work out, why did you think that that worked well? Was there something that did work well? Okay, great. Now, put that in your conclusion. Obviously, if it's a big tangent, then don't put it in. But that's a good way of learning, because then if it's something that you think that you have covered the topic well, and that you think you've managed to summarise something, then pop it in the conclusion, because it's showing that you have summarised it, and in your head you have.
Yeah.
And then you can see on the feedback. And if you haven't, if you're told, for instance, you've used the same words, okay, that's something to bear in future. You don't want to just put exactly the same sentences in. And I do see that, where people say, well, I liked this bit, so I'm just virtually copy and paste. It's not about that. It's about rephrasing it. It's about, like I'm trying to do at the moment, I'm thinking, right, what other words can I use? Maybe say it out loud if you were going to describe it in a different way.
Okay, so final question then. You've said, I'm really proud of this, I'm really proud of that. Now, in academic writing, what we don't want to do is have a first person.
No, absolutely
We
not
want to be able to say, this question's asked us about da-da-da-da-da, we've considered, or this evidence has been considered, this evidence has been considered. So we'd be using language pretty much like that.
We would.
But the point you're making, I think, is about the extent to which you're proud of doing certain things. So you might have spotted, for example, that whilst this theory covered all of this, actually it didn't say much about this. Or you might say, this theory only addresses this part, but when we try and look at this, it doesn't really have much to say about it. So you're proud of that, but that's sort of, you'd frame that. How might you frame that then in a sort of objective and academic way?
So you wouldn't say, I noticed that there was a lot of evidence. You would say, the evidence for creaming the butter and sugar together to make the Victoria sponge is much greater than the evidence for frying being important to create it, or the evidence for the temperature being critical. So that's not saying, I have noticed that I had to beat them together. No, the evidence for is more compelling, is one way of saying it. And it is an opinion, but it's not a personal opinion. It's saying that this works, whereas that one doesn't. So that's a way of using words in a third-person objective way.
Perfect. And we've covered a lot of that in our workshops that Isabella and I do online. We have these hour-long workshops in Adobe Connect where we've been talking about various aspects of the writing process. And if you've missed those, you can go and watch them on Catch Up. And also we've got a whole programme of events lined up for the next year that you can get a free ticket to, but places are limited, so do book onto that if you'd like to join us. Isabella, thank you very much. We're going to talk a lot more about cakes and the ingredients for introductions, when hopefully we can make sense of how to round this circle. I hope you've enjoyed watching that video. I hope some of that's made sense. Let's just go to HJ and then I'm going to show you the Wordle about some of the things that you think about introduction, conclusions even. HJ, how's everyone?
We're doing well. We've got a lot of great ideas about notes. So Davin says he clusters his notes, and if there's any useful ones, he can go back to it quite easily because of the way he organises it. Katie explains her notes to someone else, see if it makes sense, so for when she goes back later as well, which I think is really useful. And Libby's got a fab idea where she puts her notes on little magnetic strips, and then she can move them around like a movable mind map. I really like that one. I think that is a top tip.
Brilliant. And I see you're putting things on your board behind you, HJ.
That's it.
Being very busy.
I've put some of my favourite stuff from this morning. So I really liked what Tassim said about thinking of critical thinking as evaluating. As Paul said, it's a great way to think about it. And Davin's got a great tip about reading the conclusions of other papers as well. So academic papers, or maybe in a newspaper. Just get an idea of what a conclusion could look like somewhere else, and kind of get some of the points we've been talking about today.
Brilliant. Excellent. Well, I hope you've enjoyed that. We're going to have a quick break now while we eat some cake, and we'll show you a replay of something that we did a couple of weeks ago, which is a session with Jill Clifton all about critical thinking. Again, it's taking this idea that they're common things that we do every day, but actually we're already critically thinking, and Jill will talk us through how to apply that. So enjoy that video, make sure you grab some lunch, and then I'll be back with Isabella to talk about introductions in about 25 minutes. See you soon.